have some questions that she didn't touch at the end and talk with you about it.
Okay, once again, my name is Katya. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for meeting us. I'll be doing most of the questions for the first half. I think at the end, maybe we can all talk together, but for now, I'll be doing most of the questioning.
Okay.
So again, thank you for coming. Before we begin, we do have some consent forms. We just want to have a couple reminders. This is a voluntary participation interview, so there's no risk and no benefit in participating except for expanding the knowledge of this property and the landscape and how it interacts with the city of Milwaukee. Also, it is not confidential, so your name will be used in we'll be putting all this information onto our website and using it to help our project at the end. So just letting you know that your name will be mentioned. If there's anything that you don't want, that you want redacted over the course of this interview, you just have to contact Orajit Sen, who is, we can give you his contact information, and that's no problem whatsoever. But we have some forms to look over. And you can either take them, we can sign them later or now, that's up to you. But it just reviews the, just the use of the information from this interview in our work for the course of the summer.
Okay.
Is it something you want to sign now, or do you want to take home with you, or
even
I guess
a verbal okay is
I presume it's a form you've used before, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm perfectly willing to sign it, but I would like a copy for my files.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Let's see, I guess.
I can go make a copy.
great.
Give me a pad behind that.
Yeah, so does your name there? And then I'll fill out my name and the date. I can do that.
Okay.
And today is the 17th. That is, if you don't mind, just providing your name and address. Thank you. And this is, again, just another one explaining a bit of the project that we're doing. So we are, it's a historic preservation field school. We are trying to document the historic Water Tower neighborhood. Our group is focusing specifically on this building, on the Villa Terrace, and how it interacts with the surrounding community. So we're trying to do architectural maps of the actual building and do as many interviews as possible to get a broad understanding of what this means as a home and as a museum today. So again, if you don't mind, down there. And that is the last signature. And if at any point you have any questions about what we're trying to do, please ask us or also contact our professor.
And I have his contact information.
Okay. Yeah, and it's on, everything is on these sheets as well.
Am I wrong in signing that?
No, that's...
Signature versus printed?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, this is fine. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so if you don't mind, can we just begin, just for the record, if an introduction of yourself and your relationship with this Villa Terrace?
Well, I was asked by the Friends of Villa Terrace back in 1997 to prepare a master plan for um, clearing away what was a garden in decline and making the villa more visible from Lincoln Memorial Drive. And I've always loved Villa Terrace. And I thought I was qualified to do the plan, in that I'm one of those rare people that had Latin as language in high school. I'm ashamed to admit that I've forgotten everything. And I've always been interested in ancient Western history, and particularly the Italian Renaissance. I donated all of my time and simply charged for my staff landscape architects in preparing planting plans and plant lists under my supervision. And that was 97. The plan was accepted, and in 98 they started clearing the bluff, because as I mentioned, you could not see the villa from Lincoln Memorial Drive. And of course we wanted to open up the view to Lake Michigan again. And then in 99 they started planting trees, and in 2000 we did the sod and shrubbery, and then the garden opened in 2001 with a big gala. And I like to point out that this is the third version of a garden on this site. Perhaps you learned in previous interviews that Lloyd and Agnes Smith had gone to Italy on their honeymoon, fell in love with Italian architecture and gardens, hired David Adler as the architect to design the house. He worked with Rose Standish Nichols, famous Bostonian landscape designer. Unfortunately, any of her drawings were lost in a home office fire, and what few documents are available are still in the University of Minnesota Library, and there's no references to this house or this project. Remembering that the Smiths offered David Adler two different properties, this property or some vacant land up in Fox Point, and David Adler chose this property, saying, if you work on this site, I will give you your view of the Mediterranean. And in fact, the signature at the entrance gate is Sopra Mare, or above the sea. And the house, the Smith family occupied the house in 1923. They did not do more than terrace the hillside and David Adler's design for the water staircase, which is copied from Villa Chiconia, and the water basin at the bottom, and then at that time the property also went directly to Lake Michigan, which there was a seawall about where the present statues of Hercules and Diana are located. And when we made a sewer line from Lincoln Memorial Drive to the restroom facility at the bottom of the hill. They had to bore through that, so we know exactly where that seawall was built. Considering the family moved in with small children and had to furnish a new home, and then the Depression came in 1929, they chose not to proceed with making more elaborate gardens. As part of the Milwaukee improvements under the socialist mayor and common council, Lincoln Memorial Drive was a project to give more of the greater Milwaukee residents access to the lake. And all of that was done with landfill beyond the seawall. Lincoln Memorial Drive was opened in 1932. And the only thing, the interviews with the children regarding the garden that they remember from their childhood is that there was a small chicken coop at the base of the hill where we built the restroom facility, which we refer to as the temple. I should mention that the temple was designed by the architectural firm of Plunkett and Rasage, and they donated all of their services. The tile work was all donated by Kohler Company, who owns Ann Sachs tile, and Kohler also donated all the toilet facilities. Then, after Mrs. Smith, Lloyd Smith died, Mrs. Smith remarried a banker in New York, and she spent most of her summers here, but the social opera party season in New York. So the house was basically shut down. And then in 1974, federal funds out of Washington were given to historic homes to make restorations and improvements for the U.S. Bicentennial, and Milwaukee County Landscape Architects did a formal garden plan with 4 bosques covered with white gravel, planted with sugar maples, and bordered with privet. Then in the mid 1984-5, Lake Michigan was at an all-time high. Waves were coming over Lincoln Memorial Drive. This property sits a little lower than the property on either side, and it flooded and the water stayed. Privets are marginally winter hardy, and they had died. The maples do not like wet feet, so they died. The county budgets were cut so that when the maple trees lost their leaves, they no longer were raked up, and the gravel was just smothered in leaf. And there was no choice really but to wipe the slate clean and come up with a new design. In the Italian tradition, the hillsides would have been planted with either orchards or vineyards. And I love to mention the movie version of Much Ado About Nothing with Kevin Branagh and Emmy Thompson. Spectacular inspiration. So we chose to plant the hillside as an orchard not wanting to maintain grapes, which requires a lot of insecticide, and not wanting to do an apple harvest, we did it in flowering crabs, in the dwarf variety up near the terrace, and then graduating sizes to the largest one down the slopes. They're in bands of pink blooming and white blooming crabs. They are underplanted with 3,000 narcissus. The narcissus are native to Greece and Turkey and other parts of Asia Minor, so we wanted that botanical reference. They have multiplied wonderfully, and we probably have about 12,000 narcissus that bloom before the crabs, and then the crabs follow. I basically designed the garden with a script, and I'm glad to give you a very brief tour of what we did and why we did it. We, of course, wanted to open the view of the lake, and so we did not replete the bosques. The main visual axes from the front gate through the house and the Great Hall, courtyard, extends all the way to the lake, and there I designed the Neptune Gate, which was fabricated by 3 blacksmiths in Wisconsin, Eric Mabius, Dan Nauman, and Tom Latney. They all have their specialties, and I want to make a little aside to reference the Cyril Kulnick collection. And the story goes that he was an Austrian hired by the German government to do exhibition ironwork for the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. But the fact that we still have great talent in metal craft comes from that Cyril Kulnick condition. Captain Pabst went to the Chicago World's Fair, met Cyril Kulnick, and encouraged him, rather than go back to the old world after the fair was over, to move to Milwaukee, where there was a large German-speaking population just 80 miles north of Chicago. Cyril Kulnick did work primarily in the Midwest, but very little in Chicago, except where David Adler would bring him in. Cyril Kulnick never learned to speak English, and so he basically was comfortable with German-speaking clients. That aside, the concept for the Neptune Gate was to celebrate our inland sea, and there's a bust of Neptune done by Tom Latney, and Tom Latney's specialty is repoussé, where he works with thin layers of sheet steel and then carves a mold and pounds it into the mold, and he cuts the mold in wood, all in reverse of what it's going to be. Eric Mabius, his father, has a metal factory, and Eric Mabius did all of the structural elements and frames and hinges, and when they first opened, the gates were so balanced you could push them with your pinky finger and they'd glide easily. Dan Nauman did the fancy turnings and the leaves, and we used grape leaves. There's an arch over Neptune that has stylized wave pattern that from either side could be this tradition was the wave pattern from the Greeks and the Romans, and the Renaissance represented the changes of fortune, recession, exuberance, prosperity, and recessions. But the stylized wave pattern also can be read as the S for the Smith family. Grape leaves represent hospitality and pouring of wine for your guests. There's a series of pair of fish, which is the Catholic tradition of eating fish on Friday. Typically, a statue or a Neptune would be associated with 2 Mediterranean dolphins. We took the liberty of designing those as Lake Michigan sturgeon. Dolphins and Lake Michigan just don't go together. We designed the central lawn, or in Italian called a prato, to accommodate a large tent for our galas, which we do every 2 years. It's a major fundraiser. We try to clear 80 to 90,000 in that one evening's event, and that goes to maintain the garden, which costs between $40,000 and $50,000 a year to maintain. County offers no maintenance money for the grounds at all, even though the property was given to Milwaukee County in 1966 when Mrs. Smith moved to New York permanently. She offered the home to her children, and none of the children wanted it because of the high property taxes. And I'm sure when this house was built, it has very thick walls but minimal insulation. And I've been told that the heating bills on homes like this can run $40,000 a year. And if you look at the floor plan of Villa Terrace, almost every room has 2, if not 3, exterior walls. And
It must get cold.
no thermopane windows either. We, as I mentioned, lined up the main visual axes with the water staircase, but then also there was a proposal that there be railings along either side of the water staircase, but there would be need to be 4 railings, 2 on the outside and 2 next to the water. They would have to be in bronze and bored into the stone steps. And the bill for that was considered to be about $150,000. We chose to build the wooden service stairs, which was done for $40,000. And then tram was parallel to that, but that's another visual axis from the top looking down to the statue of Diana. On the north end, the temple and Hercules form a visual axis, and every visual axis ideally works in 2 directions. And then we have Hercules and Diana addressing themselves across the space. The semicircular wrought iron piece that's just inside the gate was donated by the Mahers, and it was architectural salvage from a house that was along the bluff here, and I don't know the location, but it was torn down. But it was part of Widow's Walk on the roof where when Milwaukee at one time had the more active harbor than Chicago. Of course, it was the coming of the railroads that made Chicago larger than Milwaukee. We've given the Italian names to the water staircase is drawing the blank of what that Italian is. The fish pond is the Vasca. I like to point out that the ancient Romans would have fish ponds, and they would go to the freshwater rivers and lakes, net the fish alive, bring them back, and hold them until they had enough to form a banquet and invite their friends. If you've been to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, there's the fish pond there that was for the same purpose, pre-refrigeration. The fish were held alive until they were served for dinner. When there's the double ramp at the base of the water staircase, in Italian it's called the scalinata doble, meaning a double pair. And below that, the steps had fallen apart, and we started by bringing in 20 10-ton trucks of soil to pack the base of the bluff and prevent it from slumping and pulling apart the water staircase. That's been very successful.
You certainly have a very deep relationship with this building in the landscape. If you don't mind me asking, do you have, can you tell us a bit about your first memory of this, of the Villa Terrace?
I moved back, I was born and raised in the western suburbs of Milwaukee, and then took my first job in Pittsburgh, moved back to Milwaukee in 1970, and by that time this was a public museum, and of course you walk through those gates into the courtyard, you just can't help but fall in love with the place. And I wanted to mention a little bit about the Italian Renaissance, in that more modern research has shed some light on what triggered it. The Italians certainly weren't sitting around saying, we're bored, let's start a Renaissance. It really coincided at the time that Marco Polo and his father and his uncle went to China. Marco Polo spent 12 years there. They came back and talked about gunpowder, paper money, golden passports. The emperor had given the Polos these gold tablets, which gave them carte blanche to travel anywhere in the empire and be protected. If anyone should attempt to harm them, they'd get decapitated quite quickly. The Chinese already knew that the Earth was round, not flat, like the Pope said it was. The Italians were reluctant to sail out of the Mediterranean because you'd fall off the edge. The Chinese already knew that the Earth revolved around the sun, which even in the time of Copernicus, there was controversy, and I'm not sure it's Copernicus. But anyhow, the Italian astronomer was excommunicated by the Pope, and you could not get last rites, and you could not be buried in a cemetery, because believing or teaching that the Earth revolved around the sun was heresy. So there's this conflict of a more knowledgeable culture waking up a very sleepy European papal-driven hierarchy. I'd encourage you all to read a book called 1421, the year that the Chinese circumnavigated the world. Follow that up with, well, what I did first is read a new biography of Marco Polo, then biography of Genghis Khan, and then 1421. So another aside of history is when Columbus wasn't subsidized by the Spanish, he moved to Portugal, and they provided him maps which had been copied from the Chinese maps, and it was a piece of cake. He wasn't worried about falling off the edge once you had a different base of information. So those are the stories I like to weave. When we started packing the earth at the bottom of the bluff, we had to raise the back wall higher than what David Adler had designed. So that was about twice as high. We repeated the barrel arch that's in the loggias on either side. In the basement, we happened to find carving of a lion mask. And during the 400 years of the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, where they had conquered most of the territory, the Romans erected lion statues anywhere on the roadways where the water was safe to drink, like a spring or a stream. And any of the pilgrims in the empire knew that the water was safe. And that's how we have the tradition of lions as fountainheads, lions as handles on ice buckets, and we tell that story as well. Our Vasca currently has a leak and is not full of water, but we imported 3 lead fish as fountain features that represents the 3 rivers of Milwaukee, which you all know as the Kinnickinnick from the south, the Menominee from the west, and the Milwaukee River from the north, coming together to form the harbor.
You mentioned just now putting in extra building up on the bluff. I was wondering if you can speak more on the challenges of building on such a drastic slope.
Well, as you're familiar with many of the properties along Lake Michigan, it's part of the history that it was layers of sand, geologic history, layers of sand, then layers of clay, all deposition, and then uplifting. But after there are heavy rains, the water will move through the subsurface in that sand level, and the clay above it will turn into grease, and the bluffs will slump. Grant Park is an extreme example of that to the south, and then some of the properties here. Villa Terrace was never in danger because their property, the property extended to the lake, but the extra earth was brought in to prevent that. A number of years ago, we had a big 4-inch rainstorm in Milwaukee, and we did need to do repairs on the Scalinata Doble because that washed away just because of the surface runoff.
So as the architect and designer of the landscape, did you have a particular experience that you wanted to create?
Well, it needed to be formal, and I referred to all the visual axes that we worked with. The Greeks were gardeners before the Romans, and they are very mathematical in their rigidity and their golden mean proportion, which is 3.14.
Mm-hmm.
So we tried to accommodate that concept. In the early Greek civilization, much of the country was very wild and forested and bears, and the gardens represented a sense of man's logic and organization and civilization. And the Romans basically copied the Greeks.
You have a wealth of knowledge on the Mediterranean and the confluence of cultures, and it's very clear here, especially when you mentioned the fish in the pond, that the confluence of those three rivers, it's kind of imitating that same concept. Was the Villa Terrace your first villa that you worked on, or is this something at a style that you have had an interest in for some time?
It's most Italian, most formal garden I've designed. I've worked on over 40 public gardens in the United States and historic properties. Most notable among the public gardens is Green Bay Botanical Garden, which started from scratch 15 years ago and is nearly built out now. A remake of the gardens at the Payne Art Center and Arboretum in Oshkosh, Janesville Rotary Gardens, 3 gardens in Indiana, some in Ohio, Michigan, and Iowa. And I happened to get the Botanic Garden in Wellfield Botanic Garden in Indiana because they called Galen Cates, who's the head horticulturalist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and asked for a reference, and he gave them my name and interviewed 4 firms and picked us, and so that's how that happened, but it's all been referenced. And in terms of historic properties, most notable is 10 Chimneys out in Genesee Depot, and that was working to develop a timeline of the Luntz theatrical life and how they would have a very successful show and then have money to spend, and then another successful season and money to spend, and everything was built incrementally, but it was basically supported by their theatrical success.
When you were planning this property, did you find that you had the freedom to do your own research and to kind of elaborate your own ideas, or were you following a set plan? I guess how much guidance were you given?
I came up with my concept after the place was cleared. We had very little in the form of base maps, Google or Bing for aerial photos was not existent back then. We did some on-site measurement and sort of fudged the vertical height, but it's approximately 60 to 66 feet between the lower level and the Parnassus Terrace. If you know your Greek and Roman mythology, the big gods lived on Mount Olympus and the lesser gods lived on Mount Parnassus. One of the gods that lived on Mount Parnassus was Apollo, and with his chariot he pulled the sun across the sky. They never explained how he got back to the east again every morning. But that's why we chose that as the Parnassus Terrace. And the terrace here we nicknamed the Terrace de Luna to celebrate the rising of the moon over Lake Michigan. And all of the days when there's a full moon over Lake Michigan is when many Milwaukeeans are envious of those who have that view. And we have a fall event called Villa Luna, which we always target for either the late August, early September harvest moon. And it's spectacular.
Have you always had an interest in Greek and Roman mythology?
I did. I was reading it as a grade schooler, checking out books from the library.
Can I ask what your favorite myth is?
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that, but I'll digress and say we have the little putti, which represent the four seasons in child form, and we have musicians, we have the woodwinds, the strings, the timpani, and we've never been able to find one of the brass. Also, we have architecture represented with architect/builder holding a roll of plans and a set of calipers to translate dimensions on a plan to larger needs for cutting stone and wood. We also have an actor with holding a mask and a script. All of those were manufactured in Italy and shipped to Villa Terrace, and we did the sourcing for that. And then, do you know the story of Mercury in the courtyard?
Only a little, but you can tell us again.
The darker middle section was excavated from the Tiber River in the 1600s, and then to bring it back to life, the studio of Bernini carved the rest of the body, and judging from the weight on the hips, they knew that all the weight was on one foot and the other foot was extended and resting. We refer to it as the Mercury Terrace, however, the Mercury Courtyard, being Mercury was the Italian version, Hermes was the Greek version of the same god, and known by the winged sandals and the winged helmet. And Mercury's holding a bag, presumably with gold coins. And, you know, if one god was having infidelity with another god's wife, there would usually be hush money or a bribe to keep secrets, liaisons a secret. Even to this day, that Mercury statue is used by FDD florists, and if there's some difficulty in, let's say, a marital relationship, in the old days there'd be, send the flowers before you get home. Modern day, I think it's less infidelity, but more fighting over finances and who does earns the money and who raises the children, and the old traditional role rivalry between male and female. So we tell that story for particularly children who we give tours to. The pebbles in the courtyard were gathered from Lake Michigan's beach.
By the children of the
By the
family.
children, the Smith children, and they had assignments of how much the workers would need the following day. And in the more rustic areas of Tuscany and other agricultural regions of Italy, they would use stones of that scale. The villas in Rome would have been terrazzo and finely fitted and multicolored, but this is very appropriate to the country house.
One thing that our field school is very interested in is the relationship between the building and the water. In particular with this Villa Terrace, how it's very perfectly situated on the lake. And so one thing that we want to talk about is how much thought was behind all the different water installations within the garden, in the front courtyard and in the back. And if there's any other thoughts you might have on the focus of water, the importance of water in this house.
Well, let's start with the courtyard. David Adler designed the pool, and if you look in the yellow room on the south wing, you'll see that there's a different, there's a white marble, large alabaster fountain bowl. But shortly after the villa was given to the county, and at that time there was a very close relationship between Villa Terrace as a decorative arts museum that housed a branch of some of the decorative arts from the art museum, which again was smaller at that time as well. This statue came on the market, and it was in a European garden, I don't know the origins, and then moved to an industrialist on the East Coast, and then when that family sold property, they sold off the statue, and the Milwaukee Art Museum Garden Club purchased it for installation here. As part of that, the base of that statue was raised, and you'll notice the lion masks on that, but it references also the lion masks that are the drain scuppers for that upper loggia where they're piped to throw water or drain water off the porch. And I referenced the lion mask, which we installed. I mentioned the references to the water in the Neptune Gate. Another feature in the Neptune Gate, which I'd like to show you, is there are medallions, and they represent the main economic engines of Italy, which was agriculture, mining, banking, and the church. And the mining was represented by a spade. The church by a cross. It'll come to me when we go down there. Remember, this is 15 years ago or more.
Right. Do you know in the original gardens, were there as many water features as there are now?
No.
None.
And of course, when the house was built, Lake Michigan was right at the seawall. If you're familiar with Russell Zimmerman's book called Magnificent Milwaukee. He documented the great mansions in the city, and the cutoff date was 1923, and since Villa Terrace opened in 23, it wasn't included. The book was written, published in 23. It was, the manuscript was completed in 22. But anyhow, I referenced that book because there were very elaborate Italian gardens directly north of here with neoclassical architecture. And that story, that Captain Pabst offered both of his children those lots, and they got to picture the architecture, and his daughter picked the neoclassical one, and the son picked the German sort of Baroque one. They share a common driveway between the two and then split to garages on each side. There's another interesting story down the way. You notice there's another property that has a private fence that goes directly to Lincoln Memorial Drive and then back to the house. That's the Van Alia residence, passed down through many generations. And when the county executive was acquiring all of this land, the county bought all the flat land, and then from the bottom of the bluff up, the owners kept that property. And Mrs. Van Alia was the holdout. And finally, county executive called Mrs. Van Alia and said, "Mrs. Van Alia, we have this multi-million-dollar public works project, and we can't proceed until you offer the sale." And she says, "Well, you've never asked me." The county executive said, "I know that our county lawyer has talked to your lawyer, but we've never heard a reply." She said, "Why don't we go to lunch?" And so over lunch, he asked her personally, face to face, and she said, "Of course I will." But it's a wonderful story and an example on nothing seems better than face-to-face negotiation.
Yeah, it's all about the close personal interactions.
Right.
What do you know anything about when the beach of Villa Terrace was made public and this was remained private? Do you know anything about how that transaction occurred? Were there any tensions, or was it a smooth transfer?
I think so. The road opened in 1932, and I'm sure you're familiar with the old Frederick Law Olmsted legacy at Lake Park.
I'm actually not from around
Okay.
here.
The Chicago World's Fair hired Daniel Burnham as the major planner, and then Frederick Law Olmsted out of Boston as the landscape architect. You can write down another book called Devil in the White City. You read it?
I just purchased it, actually.
Oh.
I went to school in Chicago, so I want to read this.
But anyhow, Chicago paid all the train fare. This was pre-commercial air flights. For Olmsted to travel to Chicago, and then Milwaukee Thrifty Burgers only paid his train fare from Chicago to Milwaukee. And Olmsted did the conceptual plan for Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park, Lake Park, and Riverside Park. And we're familiar with Olmsted's work in Boston, where he did what's called the Emerald Necklace with these carriageways connecting the major park. That's pretty much how Milwaukee followed that tradition, with parkways following the rivers, keeping that land as floodplains rather than aggressive development outside of downtown. And it was later on when the new water treatment plant was built that Lincoln Memorial Drive was filled in with a road up to Kenwood.
Interesting.
It all weaves together.
Yeah, it certainly is.
And of course, also significant to the neighborhood is the water tower,
Mhm.
which is taller and more beautiful than the runty one in Chicago.
One thing that I'm curious about, and as an outsider, I went to school in the Midwest, but it's a new region for me. So one thing that struck me first coming into the Villa Terrace was how unique it was compared to the surrounding buildings in the neighborhood. So obviously it has a very big name. It's very clear that it's a destination people want to see. But as someone who's worked here and who has a continuing relationship with the building and the staff here, how do you feel it stands as a participating structure in this community, in this neighborhood?
The villa would benefit from more use. Some of the county supervisors want to cut funding with the idea that it's sort of an east side country club without the golf course. And yet it's heavily booked for weddings, in particular during the summer season. I'm on the Friends of Villa Terrace board and have been for 23 years. And we feel that the management really needs to more aggressively pursue business conferences and more nighttime use. You know, why are they closed Mondays and Tuesdays? Mondays for cleaning, of course, and many museums are closed on Monday. But Wednesday through Sunday from 11, they don't open till 1 and close at 5. I don't think it costs that much to staff the people to make it more accessible, and I know working here as also a garden volunteer, people are coming at 11, 12, and they're so disappointed that the museum isn't open even on the open days, and some of them come back after 1, and I'd say 50% of them don't come back.
What would your vision be for the Villa Terrace in the upcoming years? What do you imagine for its future?
Building on winter lecture series that we have about gardens and garden design and horticulture, I would like to see other lecture series about the other historic homes in the neighborhood. And build on the relationship with the Water Tower Trust.
Okay. Great. I think at this point, do either of you have any additional thoughts or questions? These are the 2 architecture students of the group, so they have a bit more of a technical mind for what the scope of such a project of making the gardens the way that it is today.
I'm available for garden tours. In fact, I have 2 coming up at the end of the month and beginning of July. And one that I'm particularly looking forward to is the Indianapolis Art Museum. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's one of the best museums in the Midwest. And I don't know what their full bus itinerary and who they're going to first and later. But I think we also need to reach out to, let's say, the travel agents that put these packages together to bring other museums to this place and get more publicity and attendance.
Do you work as intimately with the other properties you've worked on, or is the Villa Terrace the main board that you serve on?
It's the main board that I serve on, although I'm also on the board of Friends of Juneau Park, and have done a master plan for that if the politicians can ever move forward on funding. And I served on Lake Park Friends Board for I think it was 6 years.
Great.
I have a question relating to something you were talking about earlier. I like to hear a lot about the design having influence from earlier times and the different stories you told about the Greek and Roman myths, and even the uses of some of the smaller design features and how that relates to history, and really enriches the design and can talk about it more than just the vegetation itself, but it has a deeper meaning and has for a long time. And you mentioned that the garden and landscape of the Greek times against the harsh landscape, the natural landscape that was there, meant something. It sort of means security and shows how prosperous the culture is. And since the Villa Terrace has such a prominent face for the lakefront and for the public that walk along or drive along the lakefront, I was wondering if you could compare those two ideas, and even if it's just from your thoughts of your design, how do you see the Villa Terrace speaking to Milwaukee and speaking to the community as the landscapes of Greek times spoke to the culture?
I try to keep the focus more on the Italian and Roman. And in the courtyard we have Doric columns. On loggias there's an Ionic reference. We purchased a couple of Corinthian column fragments from Architectural Salvage in Chicago, and they're currently located upside down and support flower pots, but we can talk about Doric, Corinthian, and Ionic order. With the statues, we have Mercury, and I've told you about that. We have a statue of Ceres, who is the goddess of agriculture. Persephone was a goddess, and she had 3 daughters. Pomona, which is the goddess of orchards, and anyone who's in raising apples or peaches or anything is a pomologist. Flora is represented as the spring, but sort of the goddess of flowers, and then Ceres is the goddess of grain. Diana is goddess of the hunt, so that with the 2 female figures on the south side, we can refer to the early settlement of Wisconsin as being farming and hunting. So they survived. And then to keep gender equity, we needed a male figure, and there were no male gods available in the Italian catalogs. But we picked Hercules, who sort of was born as a mortal, and later elevated to, let's say, a demigod. But let's go down in the garden, and we'll start at the Parnassus Terrace, and I can point out more specific references.
Okay, that sounds great.
These urns were designed by David Adler, but they represent the burial traditions of the Romans. They either had very simple graves, or the elaborate moneyed class would have elaborate sarcophagus, but over 50% of the burials were from cremation. So this would be a reference to cremation urn, which after the ashes would be put in would be mortared in place. Behind you is the English oak, because the Smith family was from England. The large pots are manufactured in Crete, and we ordered them from there. The lemon trees have a reference to Marco Polo again, or his contemporaries. The citrus, both oranges and lemons, originated in Southeast Asia, and then the seeds were brought to Italy, and they would grow them in large terracotta pots, but even in Rome, the winters were too cold for them, so they would put them into open south-facing loggias, which would absorb the heat of the sun and then reflect it out at night. And taking that a step further, Louis XIV did his La Orangerie, but it was just glassing in what the Italians had done.
What inspired you to use the cremation urns?
That was David Adler's design,
Okay.
and part of the original.
Okay.
So here we have a putti with, let's call it a lyre, a stringed instrument. Here you have an artist with a palette and paintbrush.
Are these original, or were they put in?
You know, it's interesting. There were no statues when I started here, and when we were fundraising for the renovation of the garden, it was the same time that the Milwaukee Art Museum was fundraising for the Calatrava, which kept, I think, went like 4 times over budget. It was just sucking money out of Milwaukee. And then I thought we needed the putti. It just seemed so appropriate. And I'm sure that the more elite curators at the Calatrava were saying, "Oh, how corny. Why would he do that?" And then come back sometime and watch the old family movies, the Smith family. And lo and behold, there was some of these putti on this very balustrade in the same locations, and it was just a gut feeling for me. So we refer to this as the Musician's Terrace with, the woodwinds, 2-string, and the timpani. But again, I've never found a source for the brass, in which case we'd trade out one of the strings. Now, Also wanted to mention, I don't have my script, Apollo had 7 daughters, which were known as the Graces, and I can't tell you their names, but I think one is Theseus, and to this day, and she was the goddess of dance, so, I'm sorry, Terpsichore, and her, even today, competitive dancers are called Terpsichoreans, and all of the arts are represented in those. There was comedy, tragedy, oratory, and others. But, you know, I wrote that into the script that if I was carrying note cards, I'd have the information. And then these are the putti of the 4 seasons. And spring is represented with the flowers, diminutive of the goddess Flora. Then winter is with the fire pot, warming his hands, a little too close for my taste, and a cloak. And then the grapes would be fall with the pressing of grapes and wine, and the harvest of wheat, again related to the daughter Ceres, Persephone, would be the summer. I talked about the torchieres when we get down below. Here's our actor with the mask and script, architect builder, plans and calipers. David Adler had specified terracing of this hillside, which relates to the steps on the water staircase, and we just cleared that.
What were those specifications?
The grading for the hillside.
Do you have much interaction with the current gardener here?
Yes, not only as a garden volunteer, but as a member of the garden committee, which is a subcommittee of the board. So here's our statue of Ceres. And well, I mentioned her mother was Persephone. Persephone was married to Hades, god of the underworld, and she agreed to the arrangement if she could come back to Earth in the summertime, and then when Persephone would go to hell in the wintertime, probably to stay warm. That was the Roman version of why we have winter and summer. I like to point out that the statue is carved in the French style. You'll see the scroll work at the bottom, which is very French. A bare breast. The English, the Greek and Roman goddesses would have been more modestly clothed, and a bare leg and a coquettish smile. It's the French come on. I should point out that we use maple trees again. They are a hybrid between the red maples of northern Wisconsin swamps and the silver maple of the lower Wisconsin riverways, and a hybrid selection that is columnar. They'll grow about as wide as the bed and grow together and form living hedges without a great deal of maintenance.
Was there an idea to use native plants within the Italian style in the gardens?
No. We have low-growth sumac, which sumac is native, but this is a horticultural variety. We have a small collection of peonies and a variety called Athena, only because she was the goddess of Athens. And we have iris. And Iris was sort of the female version of Mercury. She was a messenger between the gods, but goddess of the rainbow. But the tradition of Iris is that they're the only flower in the world that comes in such a fantastic range of colors. A rainbow of colors. We have early dwarf, intermediate, and tall German iris that have a sequence of bloom at different stages. This is, the spearheads are bronze, and they were cast by a couple of women forgers, and they are copied from a spearhead that is in the Cyril Kolnick collection. And then this is steel, and the concept of this tripod is when the Roman soldiers were in encampment, they would tie their spears together and then put a basket in and burn what was called fat wood to light the camps at night. And this held an oil lamp, and then that could be removed. There's been only one wedding in the lower garden, and it was the Smith's granddaughter who had the privilege.
What are the gardening events that happen here now that utilize the garden or the house or a combination of them?
Well, looking at the season, we have the garden lecture series, we have various art exhibitions. The Friends board tries to do a small exhibition. Most recently was Fabergé eggs from the Imperial Russian family. We've had porcelain exhibits. A few years ago, my Japanese bronze exhibit was here. All of the plants we've selected, so should this ever flood again, nothing would get killed by it.
This must have required a lot of future planning then, since there already had been floods and other issues with destruction of the garden landscape.
Right. This area has some sandy soils on top. It's an old geologic beach when Lake Michigan was higher and the sand was deposited. So we do have an irrigation system. The semicircular bench is called an exedra. If you've been to the Capitol in Madison, along the diagonal stairways, you see the exedra with eagles. biggest, most prominent ones in this country are at the U.S. Capitol, and they were specified by Frederick Law Olmsted. I'd like to point out that Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. They frequently would have classes in outdoor exedra. The classes were small. Much of the history or education was verbal rather than written. In this exedra, we made it as simple as possible. The base of with the fern fronds is one that I designed when I did the landscape design for the governor's residence when Sue Ann Thompson was First Lady, and it represents Wisconsin W. We've inscribed in this bench education, and opposite on this Roigiana, it's the Italian word for these covered arbors. They were a traditional part of Roman garden design to provide shady hallways with windows cut in them to view the more beautiful parts of the garden on a hot summer day. And I wanted a buffer between the traffic and the main garden, particularly if we're having a tent and festivities. We have a contemporary Wisconsin artist who did an owl for us, again representing Athena, goddess of Athens. And that's why you see owls carved on schools, book plates, museums, because she was the goddess of learning and wisdom. Just admiring the half moon up there. This is a statue of Diana, and if we step through here, you can see how she lines up with Hercules, goddess of the hunt, and she's frequently, almost any ancient statue gives you symbols of who the god is. And she usually has a quiver of arrows, sometimes with a drawn bow, sometimes with hunting dogs, sometimes with deer. Frequently tiara with a crescent moon on top on the tiara. Red-winged blackbirds love to nest in here, and they're all aflutter because we're too close, and even the sparrows are mad. Have a little rain. This, as I mentioned, is from the Widow's Walk. You can see how everything's built on this axis, and how successful our orchard is. I mentioned Neptune, the wave pattern, the stylized S, the two fish for our Friday fish fry. The round disc represents banking. Next one with the leaf represents agriculture. Then the spade represents mining and metallurgy, and then the cross for the church. And the traditional cards would have the heart and the spade and clubs and we designed the gate with Neptune's trident coming out of a flower pot, marrying our garden with our inland sea. Not the most attractive statue of Hercules, but the only one available. But you usually see him as highly muscular, but also very intelligent. And he was given 12 tasks by Zeus. Clean out the royal stables, and Hercules devoted the Tiber River and flushed it out. He killed the Nemean lion with a golden fleece, and usually is seen with a club that he used to kill and then skin the lion. Sometimes as a child version you'll see him with a little cape, a lion cape, but it's a club. And,
Where did you find the statue?
these came from Florence. And then behind his hand he's holding 3 golden apples. And the legend goes that Zeus thought his wife Hera was too full of herself, and every year in Rome, the Roman heavens, there'd be a foot race among all the goddesses, and Hera always won because she was the wife of Zeus. And so Hercules, as the foot race was going by, threw the golden apples in front of Hera, and she stopped to pick them up, and she wasn't the winner that year, and it's much easier to live with this. So this is our Exedra of democracy, and the ancient Greeks had survived under military dictatorship, omnipotent kings, and finally decided we're intelligent, educated men, we can make decisions for ourselves, and they formed the first democracy in the ancient world. They would go down to the beach to discuss the affairs of the city-state, and they would place an oil jar further down the beach. And before voting, they would pick up a white pebble on the beach or a black pebble on the beach, and they'd cast a yes vote by putting in the white pebble and throwing the other pebble on the beach. And if it was a no vote, they'd use a black pebble. The Italians for a long time would vote with black or white clay balls and called ballo, but that's how we get our word for ballot. And even today in a private fraternity or social club, if somebody applies and the membership votes against them, you'll hear the term, "I've been blackballed." All goes back 2,000 years. And on this end we have a statue of the eagle. And the eagle was the watchful companion of Zeus. And
This is by the same local artist?
yes, Corinne Wicken. And we use the symbol not only for the United States, but the Roman legions would carry a standards with the eagle when they'd go into battle. And we used that symbol for our Marines. And the Marine symbol is with spread wings and then talons. One talon is full of arrows, readiness for war. And the other talon is lightning bolts, which goes back to sort of Zeus. And the Greeks and Romans really didn't understand weather, but neither do our weathermen today. 50% of the time they're wrong. All the sprouts you're seeing are coming up from Arctic willow, which is a silvery gray when it first leaves out, but it just got so dense we had to cut it back, and next year it'll look just fine again. Botanically, this is goat's beard, Aruncus, and it's on both sides. The two outer larch are American tamarack, and the middle one is a European larch. So for landscape purposes we show both, but the European is far superior in terms of density. But it's interesting in that they lose all their needles in the wintertime, and before the needles drop they turn them golden yellow, and then in the spring they're a real chartreuse green.
Very delicate looking and beautiful.
Yep. Deciduous conifer. Notice how the barrel vault is repeated from the loges up above. And if you step over here, you see the pitch is the same as the gable in the house, with sort of a ghost representation in relief. Well, I didn't talk about the obelisk. Very popular in the Victorian times to use obelisks in cemeteries. Part of this goes back to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and the whole very elaborate, lengthy period of mourning that Queen Victoria dictated, but it goes back to the ancient Egyptians, who are the pharaohs who would declare their descendancy from the Sun King and their victories in military combat. And the ancient Romans, when they conquered Egypt, took obelisks back to Rome as trophies. The most famous pair of obelisks in, let's say, the Western world are a pair called Cleopatra's Needle. One of the obelisks sits in New York City, so next time you go to New York City, look for Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park. And one sits in London on the banks of the Thames. And if you find that, it's very close to the Gilbert and Sullivan monument. But you'll see that they left strafing boulevard bullets from when the German did aerial Luftwaffe attack on London.
I think it is raining.
I have to cut this
I'm
short.
feeling some rain.
And I wanted to mention we did roses here in that the first garden in the Western Cosimo in Florence. He married very well, one of the daughters of the Medici in Florence. who were very wealthy bankers as well as drugs and pharmacy. And Duke Cosimo collected plants that he thought would be of economic value to his principality, and then his wife collected plants like roses and lavender and things that would make perfumes and ointments.
Now that it's been, many years since the first president, what has your idea changed of how you want somebody, a visitor, to experience the garden? Do you want them to, what are the important spots you want them to really enjoy and really understand? Or do they take a quick circuit, or do you want them to linger at certain spots?
I don't know that there's a particular tour route, but I need to train more garden docents who could explain the design rationale. And I think we should, always desperate for money, charge them a quarter for a couple of pages of handouts where they could do their own interpretation, whichever route they would take, but know what they were looking at and what. The house was built pre-air conditioning. Sorry, I'm a little winded for a 70-year-old. But the servants would carry the beds out to what was a screen porch or open air for the summer.
Nice summer sleeping arrangements. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been wonderful learning from you. Do you have any questions for us or anything you want to add?
No, but let me give you a card in case you have any questions for me.
Yeah, thank you for coming out of your way to talk to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
John? Is it Matt?
Okay.
But I wanted to weave in an educational message that the garden isn't just a beautiful face, it's got some brains behind it.
Of course, and we really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It's very
you.
nice to meet you, Mr. Buettner.
Thank you so much for talking.
You're welcome.
If you want your papers are back at the table.
Oh, yes. Have you ever been here during the holidays? The garden club does decoration in the Italian style with Della Robbia and ropes, and you're familiar with the Della Robbia family that did porcelain, lemons and limes, and there's picture frames and architectural ornament.
Nice.
I'll have to stop by next time.
This would be
This
wonderful, and yeah, to see throughout the seasons. Also a very different look. Thanks, Shannon.
Almost every year when we do annuals, we do a different color scheme. so we don't build up diseases by always planting the same thing all the time.
Mhm.
And every other year with the gala, usually the gala picks a color scheme they want to use in their promotional literature, and the gardener tries to accommodate that as well.
Well, thank you so much again.
Okay?
My pleasure.
Is that the right copy?
Yeah, that's
okay,
the one.
great.
yeah.